Being a single mom is no walk in the park, but I've managed to make it work. My 18-year-old son, Danny, just started his first part-time job at a 24-hour diner about 20 minutes from our house. It wasn't my first choice for him. Working late shifts seemed dangerous, but he insisted. "It's quiet, Mom. Nothing ever happens," he said. I wanted to believe him, but that maternal instinct of mine kept nagging at me. Most nights, I'd stay up until his shift ended just to make sure he got home safe. On the nights he worked late, I'd go pick him up instead of letting him walk to the bus stop. That's what I was doing the night it happened. It was around 1:45 a.m. when I pulled into the parking lot. The diner was almost empty, except for a single truck parked near the entrance. The lot was poorly lit, the orange glow of the streetlights barely cutting through the darkness. I parked near the side of the building where Danny usually waited for me and texted him to let him know I was outside. "Coming," he replied. As I waited, I looked around the lot. The truck near the entrance caught my attention. It was old, beat up, and looked like it had been sitting there for a while. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see inside. I felt a chill go down my back, so I locked my doors out of habit. That's when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. A man was standing near the side of the building, partially hidden in the shadows. He was tall, with broad shoulders, and wore a dark hoodie pulled low over his face. Something about him felt creepy. I turned my attention back to the diner's door, willing Danny to hurry up. A minute later, he walked out, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He waved to me as he approached the car, but I couldn't take my eyes off the man in the shadows. "Danny, get in," I said as soon as he opened the door. "What's wrong?" he asked, his brow furrowing. "There's a man over there," I said, nodding toward the shadows. "Don't look, just get in." Of course, Danny looked. He looked toward the man, then back at me, trying to reassure me. "Mom, it's fine, probably just someone waiting for a ride." But as he closed the door, the man stepped out of the shadows. He wasn't waiting, he was walking toward us. I started the car, my hands holding the wheel tightly. Danny looked over his shoulder, his expression changing when he saw the man was getting closer. "Let's go, Mom," he said, his voice low. I didn't need to be told twice. I pulled out of the lot quickly, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror. The man had stopped in the middle of the parking lot, watching us drive away. His hood was still up, but I could feel his stare even from a distance. "Did you see his face?" I asked Danny as we merged onto the highway. "Not really," he said. "But I think he was standing there when I walked out. I didn't notice until you said something." A heavy silence hung in the car as we drove. I just couldn't get rid of the feeling that we were being followed. But the road behind us was empty. For a moment, I started to relax. That was until we turned onto the quiet street leading to our house. Out of nowhere, headlights appeared behind us. They came up fast, way too fast for comfort, before slowing down and keeping pace with us. My stomach dropped. "Mom, is that?" Danny started. "Just stay calm," I said, my voice shaky. "We'll go around the block a few times and see if they're really following us." I turned at the next intersection, then again and again, taking random streets in a loop. Each time, the car behind us followed, its headlights glaring in the mirror. My hands were sweating as I gripped the wheel tighter. "Call the police," I told Danny. Danny pulled out his phone and dialed 911, explaining the situation to the operator. "We're being followed," he said, looking nervously at the mirror. "We don't know who it is, but they've been behind us for a while." The operator told us to stay on the line and head to the nearest police station. I knew where it was, but it wasn't close. My heart was racing as I made another turn, hoping the car would give up and leave. It didn't. Instead, it sped up, getting closer. Close enough that I could see the outline of the driver's face in the headlights. It was the man from the diner. "Mom, he's getting closer," Danny shouted. The man's car swerved suddenly, jerking into the opposite lane before pulling back. It was like he was trying to intimidate us, or worse, force us off the road. My tight grip left my knuckles completely white as I floored the gas, speeding toward the main road that would lead us to the station. The car behind us kept pace, its engine roaring louder. Danny was yelling into the phone, telling the operator everything, but I could barely hear him over the pounding of my own heart. Finally, we saw the flashing lights of a police station up ahead. I pulled into the lot, slamming on the brakes as the car behind us stopped abruptly at the entrance. The man didn't pull in. Instead, he sat there for a moment, his headlights glaring, before reversing and speeding away into the night. 2 officers came out to meet us as we jumped out of the car. Danny explained what had happened while I tried to catch my breath. They took our description of the man and his car and promised to patrol the area, but I could tell by their tone that they weren't optimistic about finding him. "Do you think he followed me out of work?" Danny asked as we sat in the station, waiting for a report to be filed. I nodded slowly. "I don't know why, but yes." The next day, Danny quit his job at the diner. I didn't argue with him. Whatever that man wanted, we weren't going to wait around to find out. But sometimes late at night, I'll find myself looking out the window, watching the street, and every time I see headlights, I wonder if he's come back. Back when I was in college, I used to work at a 24-hour diner to help pay my tuition. It wasn't the busiest place, but the location, on a stretch of road just outside town, meant we got a mix of regulars, truckers, and the occasional drifter. Most nights were quiet, and I liked it that way. But one night, I experienced something that still keeps me awake sometimes. It was around 11 p.m., and the diner was dead. I was the only waitress on shift, with George, the cook, in the back. A storm was rolling in, the kind where the wind roars and the rain sounds like it's trying to break through the windows. I remember staring out at the empty parking lot, listening to the weather, when the doorbell jingled. A man walked in and the storm followed him. He was soaked to the bone, wearing a long black coat that dripped water onto the floor. His face was pale, and his eyes, there was something about them that made my stomach twist. He didn't say a word as he sat down at the counter, not even glancing my way. "Rough night out there," I said, grabbing a menu and walking over. He didn't respond. Instead, he slowly turned his head to look at me, his movements stiff, almost mechanical. His lips twitched into what I think was supposed to be a smile, but it didn't feel right. "Just coffee," he said finally, his voice low and monotone. I poured him a cup and set it in front of him, trying to ignore the unease building in my chest. He didn't touch the coffee at first. He just stared at it like he was waiting for something. The silence between us felt heavy, broken only by the occasional rumble of thunder outside. "Anything else I can get you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He shook his head, finally lifting the cup to his lips. He sipped it slowly, his eyes never leaving mine. I tried to busy myself with cleaning, but I couldn't stop feeling that something was wrong. Every time I looked at him, he was staring at me, unblinking. After about 20 minutes, he stood up abruptly, leaving a crumpled $5 bill on the counter. Without a word, he turned and walked out into the storm. I watched him through the window as he crossed the parking lot, his coat billowing behind him in the wind. But then he stopped, right in the middle of the lot. He turned back toward the diner, his face obscured by the rain. For a moment, I thought he was coming back inside, but he just stood there staring at the window where I was standing. I stepped back, my heart pounding, and when I looked again, he was gone. The parking lot was empty. The rest of my shift was uneventful, but I couldn't forget the memory of him standing out there in the rain. When it was finally time to leave, I grabbed my things and headed out to my car, parked at the far end of the lot. The storm had eased up a bit, but the wind still roared, and the streetlights cast long, shifting shadows across the pavement. As I reached my car, I noticed something strange. My windshield was covered in water droplets, except for one spot. There, in the center of the glass, was a handprint. I froze, staring at the print. It was smeared slightly, like someone had dragged their hand down the glass. My heart was racing as I unlocked the door and climbed inside, locking it behind me. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe a trick of the rain. But as I started the car, I couldn't escape the thought that I wasn't alone. The drive home was tense, the roads were slick, and the storm made visibility terrible. But it wasn't the weather that had me on edge, it was the feeling that someone was following me. Every time I looked in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see headlights. But the road behind me was empty. I finally pulled into the driveway of my apartment complex, relieved to be home. As I stepped out of the car, I looked around the parking lot, but everything seemed normal. The wind howled through the trees and the rain had turned into a light drizzle. I was almost to my door when I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like footsteps on wet pavement. I turned quickly, but there was no one there. The parking lot was empty. Shaking my head, I told myself I was just being paranoid and unlocked my door. The moment I stepped inside, I felt a wave of relief. The familiar smell of my apartment and the soft glow of the hallway light made me feel safe. I locked the door behind me and tossed my bag onto the couch, ready to forget about the night. But then I noticed something. The floor near the door was wet, like someone had tracked in water. My heart sank as I stared at the puddle. It didn't make sense. I hadn't walked that far into the apartment, and the rain had mostly stopped by the time I got home. My mind raced, trying to piece together how this could have happened. And then it hit me. At the diner, when the man had been making small talk, he'd asked me, "You live close by?" I'd laughed nervously and said, "Yeah, just a couple minutes down the road." It was vague and harmless, or so I thought at the time. But the look on his face, the way his eyes lingered, it was like he'd been filing that information away. I turned to look at the door, and that's when I saw it. The handprint. It was on the inside of the glass, smeared slightly, just like the one on my windshield. My chest tightened as I backed away, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. He hadn't followed me from the diner by accident. He'd figured it out where I lived, and now he'd been inside. The apartment was silent, but the air felt heavy, suffocating, like someone had been here watching, waiting. And for the first time, I regretted ever saying a word to him. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking as I explained what had happened. The operator stayed on the line with me until the police arrived. They searched the apartment but didn't find anything. No sign of forced entry, no footprints, nothing. One of the officers suggested it might have been condensation from the storm, but I knew better. That handprint hadn't been there when I left for work, and it hadn't been made by me. I didn't sleep that night, and I didn't go back to the diner either. That night, I immediately booked a flight to Jersey to stay at my sister's for 2 weeks, too shaken to even explain why. To this day, I don't know who that man was or what he wanted. But sometimes, late at night, I'll hear the faint sound of rain against my window, and I'll remember the handprint, and I'll wonder if he's still out there, watching. I had just moved to San Antonio for a fresh start. I didn't know anyone in town yet, so most nights were spent exploring, trying to get a feel for the city. It was a Wednesday night, just after 10 p.m., and I was hungry. My kitchen was still a mess of unpacked boxes, so I decided to go out and grab something to eat. I pulled up my iPhone, opened Google Maps, and searched for diners near me. One place caught my eye, a small diner a few miles away, located on a silent, out-of-the-way road. The reviews were decent, and it was open late, so I figured, why not? I hopped in my car and started driving. The diner wasn't hard to find, but as I pulled into the parking lot, I noticed it was almost completely empty. A couple of cars were parked near the entrance, but the place felt disturbingly quiet for a 24-hour spot. Still, hunger overruled my hesitation, and I parked near the entrance. Inside, the place had a retro vibe, checkerboard floors, red vinyl booths, and a jukebox in the corner. The air smelled like coffee and fried food, and a waitress stood behind the counter, flipping through a magazine. She looked up as I walked in, giving me a half-hearted smile. "Anywhere you want," she said, gesturing to the empty booths. I chose a booth near the window and sat down, looking at the laminated menu. Everything seemed normal, until I noticed the silence. It wasn't just quiet because the diner was empty. There was something creepy. The subtle sound of the glowing lights seemed louder than it should have been, and the jukebox, though lit up, wasn't playing any music. The waitress came over, pen in hand. "What'll it be?" she asked. "Burger and fries," I said, handing her the menu. "And a coffee." She nodded, jotting it down before disappearing into the kitchen. As I waited, I stared out the window at the dark parking lot. the streetlights blinking on and off occasionally, and the road beyond was completely empty. It felt like I was the only person left in the world. The sound of the kitchen door swinging open snapped me out of my thoughts. The waitress set the coffee down in front of me and walked away without a word. I took a sip, but it tasted off. Bitter, metallic, almost. I set the cup down and decided to wait for the food. That's when I saw it. Outside, just at the edge of the parking lot, something moved. It was low to the ground, darting quickly between the shadows. At first I thought it was a stray dog, but the way it moved wasn't natural. It was too fast, too fluid, almost like it was gliding. I leaned closer to the window, trying to get a better look, but whatever it was had disappeared. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my imagination. A trick of the light, maybe. My food arrived shortly after, and I tried to focus on eating, but the unease wouldn't go away. Every few minutes, I found myself glancing out the window, half expecting to see something. But the parking lot remained still and empty. As I finished my meal, I noticed the waitress standing behind the counter, staring at me. Her expression was blank, almost as if she wasn't seeing me at all. I gave her a small wave, trying to lighten the mood, but she didn't react. Instead, she turned and walked into the kitchen without a word. That's when the lights flickered. It was brief, just a second or two, but enough to make my heart skip a beat. I looked around the diner, but everything seemed normal again. I reached for my wallet, ready to pay and get out of there, but when I turned back toward the counter, I froze. The waitress was standing in the doorway to the kitchen, watching me. Her head was tilted slightly, and her eyes were wide, unblinking. "Everything okay?" I called out, trying to sound casual. She didn't respond. She just stood there, staring. I grabbed a 20 from my wallet and placed it on the table, deciding it was time to leave. As I stood up, the lights flickered again, this time longer. When they came back on, she was gone. I didn't stick around to find out where she went. I hurried out the door, the bell above it jingling loudly in the silence. The air outside felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. As I walked to my car, I looked around the parking lot, half expecting to see that strange movement again. But the lot was empty. I unlocked my car and climbed in, locking the doors behind me. As I started the engine, my headlights swept across the edge of the lot, illuminating something or someone standing just at the edge of the shadows. It wasn't the waitress. It was a figure, tall and motionless, draped in what looked like a long, dark coat. Their head was tilted slightly to the side, as if studying me. The light caught their face, or what should have been their face. It was obscured, indistinct, like trying to make out a reflection in rippling water. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move. They just stood there, as though waiting for me to make the first move. I didn't wait to find out what they wanted. I threw the car into reverse, my tires crunching against the gravel as I backed out of the spot. My hands trembled as I shifted into drive, the figure still standing there, watching as I sped out of the lot. The drive home was a blur, the streets eerily quiet, every shadow along the roadside feeling like it could come to life. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights, or worse, that figure following me. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the sight of my porch light brought a wave of relief. I parked quickly and stepped out, eager to get inside. But as I approached my car's front, something caught my eye. There was a napkin stuck under the windshield wiper, one of the diner's napkins with a message scrawled across it in uneven black ink. "You didn't finish your coffee." I stared at the note, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked around, but the street was empty. No cars, no people. Just the faint hum of the streetlights and the sound of my own ragged breathing. I didn't sleep that night. I thought about informing the cops, but my ego did not let me. I sat alone in my living room with all the lights on, my phone clutched tightly in my hand. I never went back to that diner, and I don't plan to. Whatever happened that night, I don't want to know. But sometimes, when I'm out late and see an empty diner glowing in the distance, I remember that waitress, and I wonder if she's still waiting for me to finish my coffee.